Picture this. A man of God found dead in his own church office on a quiet Sunday morning. No signs of struggle, no weapon, just a Bible clutched in his hands and something that made every detective who walked into that room stop cold. A faint smile frozen on his face. What could make a dying man smile? And more importantly, what was he hiding behind that smile? This is the story of Pastor David Richardson and the secret that destroyed everything he built. April 14th, 2019. Riverside, Alabama. Population 3,200. The kind of town where everybody knows your name, where you don't lock your doors, and where the biggest gathering of the week happens at Grace Community Church every Sunday at 10 a.m. That morning, 73-year-old Margaret Foster arrived early like she always did, keys jangling in her hand, ready to arrange flowers for the morning service. She'd been doing this for 40 years. She knew every corner of that building, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found when she pushed open the pastor's office door. Pastor David Richardson, 46 years old, husband, father of 3, beloved leader of their congregation for 12 years, was slumped in his leather chair. His eyes were open. His right hand still gripped his worn leather Bible, and across his face, barely visible but unmistakable, was a slight upward curve at the corners of his mouth. Margaret's screams echoed through the empty church halls. Within minutes, Riverside's small police department arrived. Within an hour, the entire town knew. And within days, everyone would be asking the same question: what happened in that office the night before? To understand what happened, you need to understand who David Richardson was, or at least who everyone thought he was. Born and raised in Montgomery, David felt the call to ministry at age 19. He attended seminary, married his college sweetheart Sarah, and spent 15 years serving at various churches across Alabama before landing at Grace Community. By all accounts, he was exactly what a small-town pastor should be. He visited the sick without being asked. He showed up at high school football games to cheer on the youth group kids. When the Hendersons lost their house in a fire, David organized the entire rebuild himself, hammer in hand, every Saturday for 3 months. Sarah taught Sunday school. Their 3 kids, Emma, Lucas, and little Sophie, were polite, well-adjusted, always in the front row during services. The Richardson family was the picture of faithful Christian living. But here's what most people didn't see. In the months leading up to his death, David had become increasingly withdrawn. Sarah later told investigators that he'd been having trouble sleeping. He'd pace the house at 2, 3 in the morning. When she asked what was wrong, he'd say he was praying through some difficult counseling situations, that he was carrying heavy burdens for members of the congregation. She believed him. Why wouldn't she? That's what pastors do. They carry other people's pain. At church he seemed fine. His sermons were still powerful. His smile was still warm. But a few people noticed small changes. His assistant, Carol Bennett, mentioned that he'd started locking his office door during counseling sessions, something he'd never done before. He'd also asked her to hold all his calls during certain appointments, to not even knock unless it was an absolute emergency. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Then there was Jennifer Hayes, 34 years old, recently divorced, mother of a 7-year-old daughter named Lily. Jennifer had been attending Grace Community for about 8 months when David died. She'd moved to Riverside after her divorce, looking for a fresh start, a place where she could heal and rebuild her life. The congregation welcomed her with open arms, the way small church families do. David took a particular interest in her situation. He offered pastoral counseling, helped her find a job at the local elementary school, even connected her with a single mother's support group that met Wednesday evenings at the church. On the surface, it all looked perfectly appropriate. A pastor helping a hurting member of his flock. That's what he was supposed to do. But after David's death, when detectives started asking questions, a different picture began to emerge. Phone records showed that David and Jennifer had exchanged over 200 text messages in the 3 weeks before he died. Most were deleted from both phones, but the phone company's records didn't lie. The timestamps told a story of their own. Messages sent at 11 p.m., midnight, 1 in the morning. Several church members came forward saying they'd seen Jennifer's car parked outside the church late at night on multiple occasions. One woman, Patricia Moore, said she drove past the church around 10:31 Thursday evening and saw lights on in the pastor's office. She thought nothing of it at the time. Pastors work late, they study, they prepare sermons. But now, looking back, she wondered. April 13th, the night before David's body was discovered. Sarah Richardson was out of town with the kids visiting her sister in Birmingham. David was supposed to join them Saturday morning. According to phone records, Jennifer Hayes called David at 7:15 that evening. The call lasted 3 minutes. At 8:42 p.m., security footage from the gas station across the street captured Jennifer's silver Honda pulling into the church parking lot. At 8:56 p.m., the church's own security camera, which only covered the main entrance, showed her entering the building. She was carrying what looked like a folder or envelope. Here's where things get complicated. The church's interior cameras had been disabled 2 weeks earlier. David told Carol they needed maintenance, that he'd called a company to come fix them. He never did. So what happened inside that church between 8:56 p.m. and whenever Jennifer left, nobody knows for certain. Nobody except Jennifer. And when detectives brought her in for questioning 3 days after David's body was found, her story kept changing. First, she said she'd never been to the church that night. Then, when they showed her the security footage, she admitted she'd been there but claimed she'd only stayed 15 minutes. She said David had been counseling her through some difficulties with her ex-husband, that she'd needed to talk, that nothing inappropriate had happened. They talked, they prayed, she left. He was alive when she walked out that door, but her phone's location data told a different story. Her phone didn't leave the vicinity of the church until 11:37 p.m., nearly 3 hours. What were they doing for 3 hours? Detective Marcus Webb had been with the Riverside Police Department for 21 years. He'd handled exactly 3 suspicious deaths in his entire career, all of them pretty straightforward. This case was different. The medical examiner's initial report showed no signs of trauma, no bruising, no cuts, no evidence of a struggle. David's heart was healthy, no underlying conditions, but the toxicology report, which took 2 weeks to come back, changed everything. David Richardson had high levels of zolpidem in his system, a prescription sleep medication commonly known as Ambien. Enough to make him drowsy, disoriented, but not enough to kill him. He also had traces of alcohol, which, when combined with the sleep medication, would have amplified the effects significantly. Here's the problem. David Richardson didn't drink. Everyone who knew him confirmed this. He didn't drink, not even socially, not even a glass of wine at dinner. It was a personal conviction he'd held since his college years, and he'd never been prescribed Ambien. His doctor confirmed he'd never written a prescription for any sleep medication for David. So where did it come from? Detectives obtained a warrant to search Jennifer Hayes' apartment. In her medicine cabinet, they found a bottle of Ambien prescribed to her 6 months earlier. When they counted the pills and compared it to the prescription date, they determined that several pills were missing, more than she should have taken if she'd been following the normal dosage. Jennifer's story changed again. This time she admitted that yes, she and David had been involved in an inappropriate relationship. It had started 2 months earlier. She said she knew it was wrong, that she felt terrible about it, that she'd tried to end it multiple times, but David kept pulling her back in. The night he died, she said, she'd gone to the church to tell him it was over for good. She was planning to leave Grace Community, maybe even leave Riverside entirely. But David didn't take it well. According to Jennifer, when she arrived at the church that night, David was already agitated. She said he'd been drinking, which shocked her because she'd never seen him drink before. He told her he couldn't let her leave, that if she exposed their relationship, it would destroy everything: his marriage, his ministry, his reputation, his kids' lives. She claimed he became desperate, begging her to stay, to give him another chance, saying he'd leave Sarah, that they could start over somewhere else. Jennifer said she told him that wasn't what she wanted, that she'd made a mistake, that this had to end. That's when, according to her testimony, David went to his desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. He said if this was really their last night together, they should at least say goodbye properly. She admitted she'd had a glass, maybe 2. She said time became blurry after that. She remembered David seeming increasingly unstable, pacing around the office, talking about how he'd failed God, failed his family, failed everyone who'd ever trusted him. She said he kept asking her to forgive him. Then, she claimed, he took something from his pocket. Pills. He washed them down with wine. She asked him what he was doing. He said he was just trying to calm down, to think clearly. She said she should have stopped him right then, should have called someone, but she was scared and confused and not thinking straight. When she noticed him starting to slump in his chair, she panicked. She tried to wake him up, but he just smiled at her and said everything would be okay now, that God would forgive them both. Those were the last words he ever spoke. Jennifer said she grabbed her things and ran. She didn't call 911. She didn't tell anyone. She just went home, terrified and ashamed, hoping that when she woke up in the morning, it would all feel like a nightmare. But Detective Webb wasn't convinced. Jennifer's story had changed too many times, and there was something else bothering him. When the crime scene investigators had initially processed David's office, they'd photographed everything, cataloged everything, including a sealed envelope sitting on the corner of David's desk. It was addressed to the church elders. In the chaos of the investigation, it had been filed away with other evidence. 3 weeks after David's death, Detective Webb finally opened it. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, David's handwriting, dated April 13th, the night he died. The letter was a confession, not of an affair with Jennifer Hayes. No, the truth was far more complicated and far more devastating. David confessed that 5 years earlier, when he'd been counseling a young woman named Rebecca through severe depression, he'd crossed boundaries he should never have crossed. The relationship had become physical. It lasted 3 months before Rebecca ended it and left the church. David wrote that he'd been carrying the guilt ever since, that it was eating him alive, that he'd tried to convince himself it was a one-time mistake. But then Jennifer Hayes came along, vulnerable, hurting, needing guidance, and he'd done it again. He wrote that he couldn't live with himself anymore, that every time he stood in that pulpit and preached about integrity and faithfulness, he felt like the worst kind of hypocrite. He couldn't confess publicly because it would destroy too many lives, not just his own, but Sarah's and the kids and the entire church community. But he couldn't keep living the lie either. The letter ended with a single line, "By the time you read this, I'll be free." The medical examiner reviewed the case with this new information. The combination of Ambien and alcohol, along with David's state of mind, painted a clear picture. This wasn't murder. David Richardson had taken those pills himself, knowing what would happen. He'd invited Jennifer to the church that night not to reconcile but to say goodbye. He'd needed a witness, someone who'd been part of his failure, someone who'd understand. The smile that had haunted everyone who saw his body, that made no sense in the context of an unexpected death, now made horrible, tragic sense. It was relief. Release. The end of carrying a burden he couldn't bear anymore. Jennifer Hayes wasn't charged with any crime. There was no evidence she'd given him the medication or encouraged him to take it. But the guilt she carried was punishment enough. She moved away from Riverside 2 months later. Nobody knows where she went. The church elders decided not to make the letter public. They told the congregation that Pastor David had died from an accidental overdose, a tragic mistake involving medication and alcohol. They said he'd been struggling with private health issues. It was kinder that way, less complicated. But of course, in a town of 3,200 people, secrets don't stay secret for long. Within months, most of Riverside knew the truth, or at least parts of it. Some people felt betrayed. How could a man they'd trusted, a man who'd counseled their marriages and baptized their children, live such a double life? Others felt immense sadness for David, for the prison he'd built around himself, for the fact that he couldn't find a way to be honest and seek help before it was too late. Sarah Richardson filed for divorce posthumously to protect herself and the kids financially. She moved back to Montgomery with Emma, Lucas, and Sophie. The last interview she gave to a local reporter, she said something that stuck with a lot of people. "I loved my husband, but I didn't really know him, and that's the part that hurts the most." Grace Community Church struggled in the aftermath. Attendance dropped by half. Families left to join other congregations where they didn't have to walk past that office, where they didn't have to remember. The church elders brought in an interim pastor, Reverend Thomas Mitchell, a retired minister in his 60s who'd spent 40 years in pastoral work. He didn't try to erase what happened. Instead, he preached about the reality of human brokenness, about the danger of putting spiritual leaders on pedestals, about the desperate need for honesty and accountability in the church. Slowly, very slowly, the congregation began to heal, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging the complexity of it all. That David Richardson had been both a man who genuinely helped many people and a man who'd made devastating choices. That those two things could exist in the same person. That grace is complicated. About a year after David's death, the church held a special service. They didn't call it a memorial exactly. They called it a service of lament and hope. People stood up and shared how David had impacted their lives positively. They also acknowledged the pain and betrayal. They prayed for Sarah and the kids. They prayed for Jennifer Hayes, wherever she was. And they prayed for themselves, that they'd learn from this tragedy, that they'd create a church culture where pastors could be honest about their struggles before those struggles destroyed them. So what do we take away from a story like this? How do you make sense of a tragedy that's layered with so much complexity, so much pain on every side? Here's what I think haunts people most about the David Richardson case. It's not that a pastor had an affair. Sadly, that happens. It's not even that he took his own life. It's that he felt so trapped by the image he had to maintain, so suffocated by the expectations placed on him and the expectations he placed on himself, that death seemed like the only way out. Think about the pressure David was under. In that community, he wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a symbol. He represented everything those people believed about faith, about morality, about what a godly life should look like. And when you're a symbol, you stop being a person. You can't have doubts. You can't struggle. You can't make mistakes. Because if you do, if the symbol cracks, everything it represents feels threatened. David Richardson made terrible choices. He hurt people. He betrayed trust in ways that had lasting consequences. But he was also a person who was drowning and couldn't figure out how to ask for help. And that's the tragedy. Not just what he did, but that he felt he had to hide it until it killed him. How many people are walking around right now in similar situations? Not necessarily affairs, but some secret shame, some mistake they made, some struggle they're facing that they're convinced they can't tell anyone about because of what people expect them to be. How many people are smiling on the outside while dying on the inside? The office where David Richardson died has been converted into a prayer room. The church members decided that was better than leaving it empty or turning it into storage. They put comfortable chairs in there, soft lighting, a few plants. People go in there to pray, to think, to be honest with God about their struggles. There's a plaque on the wall, simple and small. It reads, "In this room, let us remember that God's grace is bigger than our worst moments, and that hiding in darkness is always more dangerous than stepping into light." I wonder what David Richardson would think of that. I wonder if in his final moments, sitting in that chair with the smile on his face, he finally felt that truth, that he could stop performing, stop pretending, stop carrying the weight of being perfect. Maybe that's what the smile was really about. Not relief that it was ending, but relief that he didn't have to pretend anymore. What do you think? Do you believe David Richardson's death was purely his own choice, Or do you think the pressure and expectations placed on him played a significant role? If you were in his position, carrying that kind of secret, what would you have done differently? How would you have found a way to be honest before it was too late? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter. Your perspective matters. And if this story moved you or made you think, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that we're all human, we're all struggling with something, and it's okay to not be okay. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.